In this webcast, I'll be talking about the evidence for contemplative education and how we know that it works and what the mechanisms are that might be behind it. The research will be talking about will mostly be about mindfulness and mostly in school contexts. But that's not to say that what's happening in higher education isn't also enormously interesting and in need of investigation. I'm going to be talking particularly at the beginning about mindfulness-based interventions, which is a terrible phrase, and it puts a lot of people off mindfulness. But it's a phrase that comes from a medical context. And those of you who are into mindfulness may recall that Jon Kabat-Zinn, who started this work on secular mindfulness, worked in medical schools, and his early work on mindfulness-based stress reduction was very much based on a medical model, whereby you do something specific to people, you measure before and after, you have a control group, and you see whether it makes a difference. And that model is still really quite a major one in schools. And there's a lot to be said for it. It appeals to funders. People like something that's very definite of that kind. It gets published in journals, and you can learn a lot from it. So I'm not against it in any way, but it is only one way of doing mindfulness. There's also mindfulness-based approaches, which are much more principles-driven, and there's also ways in which we try and influence whole school environments. But most of the research itself is around mindfulness-based interventions. But this work is increasingly supported by very interesting qualitative research, where you ask teachers and students and pupils what it is they're making of this learning, what they like about it, what they don't, what they understand, what they have against it, how it plays out in their everyday lives. And this work is equally important, and the two of them are coming together. And I don't think there's any kind of conflict between doing a randomized controlled trial of an intervention and then finding out how it works through more qualitative work. So what kind of research is it that we're basing our knowledge on? Well, there's two essential kinds. There's the qualitative, focus groups, interviews, and so on, where you find out from people firsthand what they're making of what they are doing, what they're learning, what it means to them. And then quantitative research, where you would administer some kind of tool or questionnaire and assess, sometimes through comparing with a control group who didn't get that input, what impact it's had on people. Sometimes people present this as if it's two completely different types of research. Personally, I think they inform one another very well, and you can measure what matters. But first of all, you have to map the territory. So I think mapping and measuring go together very well. And both types of research are happening in mindfulness in schools. Probably more that's around the randomized control trial quantitative approach, but qualitative research is increasing and coming to very interesting conclusions. So what's it all adding up to? What's it showing us? What are the impacts of mindfulness and how's it working? Well, we know that the area on which it seems to have the biggest single benefits that one can demonstrate are around well-being and mental health. And this is very helpful, I think, because we all know that young people, children, and others are experiencing a crisis in mental health, with self-harm, suicide, depression really rocketing. And it's very hard for the mental health services to cope with this onslaught. I'm talking right now at the time where schools are about to go back after the COVID outbreak. And we're all really worried about young people's mental health, and we don't have the services to help with that. So knowing that mindfulness can really help young people to cope, to be resilient, to understand themselves better, to have the tools to cope with depression and anxiety is really very helpful. We also know that teachers are experiencing a tsunami of difficulty, stress. A lot of teachers are leaving the profession. They are apparently one of the most stressed professions that there are. So we know that teachers themselves really benefit from mindfulness work. It's also impacting on social and emotional learning, which is another major key to unlock education. Social and emotional learning is about understanding our emotions, to manage ourselves better, to make relationships with other people, to show empathy and compassion. And if you add mindfulness into that work, it really makes a difference. It turns work that's often quite theoretical into something that really does actually impact on young people's lives. And the evidence is very clear that it has very clear impacts on young people's pro-social ability, as it's sometimes called, and their self-understanding. We know that it impacts on cognition and learning, and this is great news for many schools who might not buy into this whole area without this, but knowing that it impacts on memory, attention, focus, what's sometimes called executive function, is really selling this in some schools, and it has quite a major impact very often. It even impacts on physical health. Teachers have less days off work if they practice mindfulness and meditation. Pupils and teachers have lower blood pressure, their cortisol levels decrease, their sleep patterns get better. We know that these impacts are happening. It impacts too on teacher effectiveness, and this is really an important area. Not just teachers' well-being and stress reduction, but actually on their abilities in the classroom to make relationships with pupils, to show empathy, to show concern, and some of the tougher tasks of teaching too, like prioritising, like seeing the point, like staying on track. All of these are really helped if you practice mindfulness. Now, the impacts are sometimes described as between small and medium statistically. And you may say, well, why are we bothering with things that might have a small to medium impact? Well, most things we do in education have no evidence behind them at all. They're just done because of common sense and everyday experience. And most educational interventions don't even have a small impact. So I think if you're having a small to medium impact, you're actually doing something quite important. So I think we should be quite pleased with the statistics that we're seeing so far on this area. Now, what do we know about what's happening behind the scenes? Well, my colleague Dusana Dorjee will talk more about this in the final session, but we do know that behind these impacts, there are some really interesting psychosocial mechanisms going on. A major one is self-regulation. This goes right across the board, whether you're talking about anger management, your ability to cope with a difficult child in your class, or your ability to focus on a difficult maths problem. The ability to be patient, to cope with difficult emotions, to stay put, to stay focused. It's a really helpful core skill that mindfulness really does enhance. Metacognition is a rather off-putting word, but it's a very helpful concept. Metacognition is when you learn to think about thinking, where you stand back from the thought stream and start to be aware and critical of what's going on in your own mind and to examine your thoughts in a thoughtful and critical way. Again, essential for everything from not falling out with another kid in the playground to realising that your anxieties about your maths test are just in your mind, and that if you just simply focus on the question in hand, you'll probably be okay. It's looking at the irrational fears that we all have and putting them back in their place. So both of those are really important underlying mechanisms. And the final one is the attention. We all know how distractible we are nowadays. Well, the ability to really focus and pay attention and keep your mind on what you're doing is essential for all of us. It's sometimes said that what we pay attention to is the quality of our lives. And if we can learn to keep our focus on what really matters to us, the quality of our lives improves. So these underlying mechanisms which we're discovering are really helpful. So what are the areas of uncertainty around mindfulness research? Well, there are a great many. The area that's usually talked about at this point, and I will mention it briefly, I think, is all the limitations of the quantitative approach. We need bigger studies. We need studies that repeat themselves and replicate. We need less bias. We need a more separation between the people who do the research and the people who investigate it, and so on. We need meta measures. And all of that is true, and that is being worked on. But I think there's some slightly deeper concerns too that we need to look at. I think we are really needing to develop educational rather than medical models of contemplative approaches in schools. This MBI type approach, where we see it as something you do to people, like an inoculation, it doesn't really work all that well in educational contexts. and approaches that are now embedding this more in the daily lives of teachers and classrooms, affecting the ethos and the way that people conduct themselves in schools, is much more comfortable for schools to work with. And I think we need better models of that, and to look at how to implement that and how to evaluate that. We do need to look at how we can expand this work, but without diluting it. And in my previous talk, I discussed the problem that if you try and roll this out too quickly and too cheaply, you wind up with it not being mindfulness at all. So we need to make sure that we know what authentic mindfulness is and how do you keep that. And that is quite an important research question. Okay, so one last area that we need to watch in research terms is that we take care to do no harm, that we don't teach this badly and have that unfortunate side effect of what's sometimes called the inoculation theory of education. You give people a tiny bit, so they never want any more. We need to make sure that we teach this so well and in such exciting and relevant ways that young people can see the point of it. And even if they don't always practice, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, they go away from it with a really positive view of the value of mindfulness. So that if later in life, when they're struggling with mental health and difficulties in a very serious way, and people offer it to them as a therapy, they feel enthused about that. So I think it's quite vital that we do no harm. So thank you for listening, and I hope what I've been talking about will give you an insight into the research we're trying to carry out, how far it's got, and what's going well, and what's not going so well. The next session is Caroline Barratt, who will be talking to you about her work in higher education and contemplative pedagogy, and sharing with you the research methods that are used in that context to explore what's happening in higher education. And the final session will be from Dusana Dorjee, who will explore in more detail the underlying mechanisms that I mentioned during my talk.